All right, so once you've chosen a topic, you need to ask yourself, what is my big idea? Hopefully, a week or so back, whenever I posted the link to the TED Talk about big ideas, hopefully you watched that and you saw the importance of narrowing your speech topic down to one big idea. What you're asking yourself is, what do you want to accomplish in this speech? You're going to give yourself a general purpose and a specific purpose. The general purpose is the overall effect you want to have on your audience. How do you want to impact them? What are you doing for them? How do you want them to be moved or challenged or changed by your speech? Virtually all speeches fall into one of three categories. It's either an informative speech. An informative speech is where you act as a teacher and you give listeners information that they were not aware of previously. Or it's a persuasive speech. A persuasive speech is where you act as an advocate. You try to persuade people. This is a lot deeper than informing. Whenever you're persuading, you're not just telling them something they didn't know. You're trying to change what they think or how they act. Persuasive speaking can be controversial. The audience may not always agree with your viewpoint. Your job is to win them over, to promote change, to convince them to think differently or do differently or act differently or be different than they were whenever you started your speech. The third category is entertainment. And to entertain is to amuse an audience. When you are giving an entertaining speech, you're trying to get your audience to laugh. You're trying to get them to smile. You will have accomplished everything you need to accomplish if you can just get your audience to be entertained. An informative speech may be where you're asked to address your youth group and give them the information about North American Youth Congress and how we're getting there and what the fundraisers are and what the costs are going to be. That's informative. A persuasive speech may be where you're asked to speak to the youth group and get them to decide what restaurants you're going to eat at on the trip. And you may have, you may be making a case for a particular restaurant for dinner. And so you're trying to persuade them. Or perhaps another form of persuasion may be to try to convince somebody to a religious or ethical viewpoint that you have. Perhaps when you're trying to convince somebody of the validity of Jesus' name baptism. That is a persuasive speech. And then the third is entertainment. This may be what you do when you're asked to speak at a youth Christmas banquet. The job of a speaker there is not necessarily to get into deep theological subjects, but rather to entertain the crowd and maybe leave them with some little thing to chew on at the end. So entertainment is about amusement. It's about causing folks to laugh. And that's the kind of venue where that would happen. All of that aligns with your general purpose. It's what you're trying to do. Then you need to craft a specific purpose. A specific purpose is the statement of your objective. If your speech is informative, then the specific purpose should include verbs like show, explain, report, instruct, describe, inform. Those are descriptive verbs for an informative presentation. If your goal is to persuade, if your specific purpose is to persuade your audience, then you should use verbs like persuade, motivate, convince. Those words that get across the idea that you want them to act a certain way. Those are persuasive verbs. There are 5 characteristics of a specific purpose statement that need to appear in every specific purpose statement. And remember, we're talking about the framework that is behind your speech. This is where your speech is developed from. You're going to get your thesis from this idea of specific purpose. And so there are 5 things that ought to always be there. The first is an infinitive phrase: to explain, to convince, to persuade, to inform. Something that tells what you are doing. The second is to remember that this is for your personal use. It needs to be written from your perspective. It needs to identify your concrete goal, and it will guide the research, the direction of the speech as you move forward. The third characteristic of a specific purpose statement is that it focuses on a single, distinct idea. We've moved from general to specific. Generally, we may have been going to talk about cars, but now we're specifically talking about Corvettes. We've narrowed it down, and we're trying to convince people that a Corvette is the best car to buy for the money or something. There's a statement that focuses on a single distinct idea. The fourth thing is that it has to relate the topic to the audience by specifying what you want the audience to know, to think, or to do as a result of the speech. So not only you're saying, what it is that you're aiming for, but what is it that you want your audience to do in response. And finally, it needs to be clear and concise, not muddled and unfocused, but focused in, clearly stated, precise language, the kind of thing that's easy to read and easy to understand. If you do this step right, the rest of the speech is really easy to write. The thesis will spring from this, and the whole speech springs from thesis. Now, you can make sure that your specific purpose is something that you can communicate in the time available. Timing is very important. You're given restrictions of time. In this class, every speech has a minimum length and a maximum length. It is critical that you speak for longer than the minimum length, but that you don't exceed the maximum length. I'm going to be hard on that. I'm going to grade you. I'm going to deduct points whenever you miss those marks. Why? Because in real world situations, it matters. Last week I spoke at Urshan during chapel, and following the praise singing and the worship and the preliminaries of the service, I was given the pulpit with the awareness that at 12:30 it's lunchtime. And so I have just a short amount of time in which to accomplish what it is that I've come to do. And if I go long, if I ignore the parameters of time that have been given to me, I'm going to extend into your lunch hour, and I'm going to cost you the opportunity to eat lunch before your next class, or you're going to get up and go to the lunchroom while I'm speaking, and I'm going to be left all alone in the chapel. One way or another, it's a bad thing to ignore the limits of time that have been placed on me. And so that's going to be true in a lot of speech situations. If you're ever asked to speak at Because of the Times, or General Conference, or any other meeting where there's a schedule and there's a flow, you're given a time slot, and you are expected to be within that time slot. And you need to be aware of that. So when you're picking this specific purpose, you need to make sure that this specific purpose is something you can fully accomplish in the time allotted. That's important. It's also helpful to assess the speech from the audience's perspective. What are they going to think about it? How will they feel about it? It's useful to consider how you want them to behave. How do you want them to respond? How do you want them to feel? After hearing my speech, my audience members will feel this way. They will behave this way. This will impact them this way. When you do that, it helps you focus the content of your speech on your audience. We talked last week about how important it is to be audience-centric. We want your speech to be tailored to your audience.